Hello, everybody, and welcome to Cave Goblin Radio. I'm your host, Xanthea back after a long hiatus. Thanks for joining us. I'm joined today by the author of one of my favorite novels of the last 5 years at least, Jackie Ess. How you doing, Jackie?
Life is good. Life is good. Yeah, I mean, good to be here in the caves with the cave goblins, saying hello.
Yeah, and I truly am in a cave. This is the first time this show has been in this new studio. Let's turn off this music. It's distracting me. No, it's almost over. Yeah, in the basement of our house now, and it's finally cooling down. But let's get right into it. So you wrote Darryll, and I have a copy here, but my chroma key is making it look really terrible. So let me just get out of studio mode. I'm really professional over here and bring up this image. Here we go. Darryll, a novel by Jackie Ess. That's you. Um, Before asking my first question, I just wanted to read the blurb for our listeners. Darryll Cook is a man who seems to have everything: a quiet home in Western Oregon, a beautiful wife, and a lot of friends to fuck her while he watches. But as he explores the cuckolding lifestyle, he finds himself tugging at threads that threaten to unravel his marriage, his town, and himself. Uh, Based on that, I was not prepared for what a moving and beautiful story this would be. So I guess my first question is, what is the origin for this character Darryll and the story itself?
It's a funny thing because I started by doing a character. Like I love doing characters, doing bits, kind of like becoming people for a second. And I wasn't initially sure, what I was going to do with it. I was living in Eugene, my partner at the time, um, and we were doing everything that's in the book. I mean, wait, no, but like we were, she had started like a nature photos Instagram, and I was looking at this image of trees, and I was like, it would be really great, like a type of guy who just sees everything in nature as this kind of Rorschach inkblot and makes it all about alpha, beta, cockbull, blah blah blah. And for some reason, I found it really funny to kind of do this character, and somebody who has that kind of like it's sort of a romantic fantasy, right? It's of a person who can narrate nature and who has these encounters with the sublime in nature. But I wanted to have somebody that's like that, that's like, like Wordsworth or something like that. But at the same time, the content is this like totally neurotic kind of thing. So I had a bunch of reasons for then like wanting to turn that into something that I made into a novel. That wasn't obvious initially. I did all kinds of stuff. Like I would just be like, yeah, like Matt, here's what Darryll would say about this, or like here's Darryll's voice. And I made a Darryll Twitter account. I always regret even telling people that I did that because then they think the whole thing is about Twitter or something like that. It's not, but I mean, I did that. Um, and at a certain point, like I started to write these like monologues in Darryll's voice and write his diary entries and sort of like I imagined his world so much. And as I started, some things started to click, and I started to see the other characters and sort of this like kind of double of Eugene that was living in the book. And I was like, oh, okay, like this is a novel. This is the novel I've been trying to write. I had put down a kind of more experimental novel that maybe like a year or two before. Um, I really don't like the experimental novel. Like I've written another novel now that hopefully will see the light of day sometime in realistic future. But like yeah, I don't use any material from the abandoned manuscript. I thought I was going to be able to, but then I looked and it's just like no, this ain't right. But I think that's part of the story. And then I think another part of the story is like kind of like constraints, where I think that at the time that I was starting Darryll, which is really kind of a long time ago, like I basically like I started figuring out this character at the end of 2016. And I had my first draft in like mid 2017, and then I just carried this thing around for ages, trying to figure out what to do with it, rewriting it every year or two, that kind of thing. But at that time, I had a bunch of concerns about like trans literature. That was such a big concept to me, which it now really isn't. Like I don't really think in those terms very much. But at the time, like I had come through this scene, like you know, um, you know, me and Tori Peters, we were old friends. We had kind of come onto the scene at the same time. We'd found Topside Press, we'd read Nevada, we were and Safe Girl to Love and all of that, and we were trying to see what we could do. Like we sort of saw this like kind of moment of opening of kind of trans literature, but it had this kind of like urgency and intensity to it that I think didn't quite hit the mark for what I was trying to do. Like I think that like that spirit that we saw is actually being like picked up and carried by some of the people that are doing it. But I wasn't going to be that kind of writer. And it was sort of painful to figure that out. But I was like, oh right, like I'm not the type of writer that Casey Flood is. Casey Flood is awesome, but that's not what I'm doing. And I'm not doing what Topside Press is doing, or what Little Puss Press is doing, or whatever. And love them to death, right? But there was this recognition that like I had to do something different. And one of the things that I noticed was that there can be a dynamic of tokenism, right? Like, and particularly, if you're a trans person of color in that kind of scene, there's a way that like everything can be read sort of through this sacralized identity. And I didn't want to do that. I didn't want to have something be read as about me or as like a statement about this is what Black trans women have it, how our perspective or something like that, for somebody to be able to do that. And I was like, I wanted to write something that was exceptionally resistant to how I imagined it being deployed as trans literature. And I also wanted it to be exceptionally resistant to like the egg theory, for example. Like I really wanted to write something that was frustrating from that perspective, where I'm not going to write a story where trans is the happy ending, and I'm not going to write a story which is like, me behaving as a like spokesperson for an identity. And so in some ways, like as I stumbled on this character, I was like, oh, this is like kind of liberating actually, that I can write as this sort of like 40 something white dude who's kind of like a uncomprehending but sort of very friendly kind of liberal guy. And I'm going to write the book that like, you know, it's going to be like my friends are going to read this and they're going to be like, this is my parents. This isn't me. And I wanted to do that for some reason. So anyway, but all of that didn't matter, right? Because I wrote it, origins, blah, 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 but like I didn't do a lot with it. So I had this manuscript, I rewrote it several times, and the origins became completely irrelevant. Like the concept of trans literature, topside, et cetera. Like I thought when I wrote this book, that the only people who read it would be people that were kind of like basically in a specific scene, who I had tons of weird beef with at the time. It's like we've all made peace. It's good. I hope we've all made peace. If we haven't made peace, call me. But like I think we've all made peace. But like the none of that stuff. It feels so petty now. And in fact, like when I think about like who read Darryll, like Darryll kind of rhymes with Nevada in some places. Like they both involve a trip to Reno. They both involve, um, somebody maybe trying to convince somebody else to transition. They both involve a kind of resistance to that. Well, okay. Um, they both have scenes of like kind of punk trans girls acting messy. Not very explicit in my book, but it's there.
I
But
actually I
like
actually read Darryll like immediately after reading Nevada, and one of my questions was going to be if that was part of the influence is when he's heading to Reno and he meets that punk trans girl. I was like, is this and I'm blanking on the name of the main character.
Maria Griffiths and James H.
Yeah.
No, I mean I think I love borrowing people's characters and repurposing them. I definitely did that with Dennis Cooper, but as far as with Imogen's characters, I think I kind of let them alone.
Hmm.
Like I wanted it to rhyme with that in the sense that I was like, I'm going to think through the same situation in a way, or kind of a twist on the same situation. But I didn't want to sort of write fan fiction of it, and I really do think my characters are very different. Like I think that like Maria is a much more chaotic character than Uthun. We also don't see very much of Uthun, um, but I think that one difference is that like Maria basically sees James H. I mean, I feel bad for if anybody's listening and you haven't read Nevada, but Nevada is about this punk trans girl who in New York who's doing a bunch of heroin, making horrible decisions, ripping off all of her friends, and kind of like this weird self-centered way, and like then just like spinning off blog posts instead of solving any of her problems. Then she goes on a big road trip, which we don't see. She shows up in Nevada and she sees this kind of dysphoric young guy, James H., um, who's a sort of a connoisseur of like the autogynephilia theory and sissy porn and so on. And she kind of sees this in him. And she's like, "You're trans. I'm going to convince you that. I'm going to show you that truth about yourself." And she kind of like accosts him, and they have, it's an interesting interaction. I don't want to ruin. I can't spoil a book that came out in 2013, can I?
Well, I mean, I read
I
it
will.
this year,
Yeah, I
so
mean, and I think so actually a lot more people are going to read this because it's finally getting re-released. FSG is going to put it out. This is huge, but it's actually getting a reprint on a major press.
I didn't know that.
So yeah, and I think this is all the influence of Tori. Like I feel like Tori has walked ahead of all of us in such a beautiful way, and she has really like made this like mainstream publishing is now curious about whatever trans literature was. Um, I'm fucked anyway because I feel like I don't even know if I write trans literature, but that is uh, let's just say that I do. But
I mean, is not
yeah.
any literature by trans people, is that not trans literature?
Um,
Is that a too heavy a
yeah,
question for the middle of a
I mean,
sentence?
it has there's a yes and no to that. I mean, like I'm personally happy to stay with that for the moment. Like I think that probably we should just use that term to refer to like whatever we think is like pretty good that's coming out of trans people writing.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes it a not very useful term for a lot of things. It's useful maybe for awards, it's useful for selling books, it's useful maybe for finding books, and maybe that's what genre is for. So like I'm cool with that, right? Like I don't think I need to hash that out too much deeper. I do think that at some point I was interested in a much more specific sense of an identity bounded literature that was like for me the model of it was like black gay literature in the 80s, right? Like if you pick up these anthologies, um, like In the Life or Brother to Brother, Joe Bean, Essex Hemphill, um, who wrote Vanishing Rooms? Um,
I
uh,
wish I could help, but I'm woefully misinformed on the subject.
oh, Melvin Dixon. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, Melvin Dixon. That was nobody reads that one. I was really into that. But it, like to me, like identity bounded literature had kind of like hit a high watermark in the 80s, and 80s and early 90s with this kind of like black gay literature. And there, I think it was a very self conscious project, kind of recognizing that there were a lot of black gay men that were sort of narrating something that didn't you didn't see their connection to other black gay men. Like that it was sort of like it was about the solitary black gay man finding his way in a largely white world. Or and at that there was a sense of like, well, what would it look like to prioritize each other? That's an interesting question, right? And I mean, I like Marlon Riggs made that movie, Tongues Untied. That's I think that's everybody's way into this, um, and it's a very beautiful sentiment. Although it has, of course, some problems with it. Like I mean, it's quite related to like like when people talk about T for T, like like every 6 months there's T for T discourse, and it's all like a million years behind the kind of black gay discourse of the 80s and early 90s.
Yeah.
Um, but I had the opinion that I was like, I want to kind of carry that forward a little bit, and I want to actually be somewhat self-conscious about what that was or how that failed in some ways. It did fail in some ways. I mean, somehow it's very beatified, right? Because we look at that generation of gay writers and activists, and so many of them died that it's like very hard to like actually admit that they weren't right about everything. And to some extent, they would have had to revise their ideas if they had survived to be able to do that. And I'm sure that they would have, right? Like, you know, like everybody, we grow up and some of us calcify and some of us adjust and some of us, uh, are just superseded. I don't know what would have happened. Um,
Well, I
there's a kind of
guess.
like a follow up to those people. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. So I was saying, I guess, you mentioned Tori Peters So, author of Detransition Baby for those listening. It makes me think of that chapter that's becoming quite famous among predominantly white trans women, such as myself, of the what is it, the adolescent African elephants, and
Oh
with
man, I've been
so
yeah.
many
Go ahead.
elders sort of dying back then, even if they were making mistakes, it's harder to iterate on that, or for people to learn when they're dead. So it's like there's a lot of feeling around in the dark still, from what I can tell.
Well, I don't agree with that.
Okay.
And so I think so to me the elephant section was really interesting, but I've been shocked by how it was taken up because the elephants are, Ames's theory, and
Mm-hmm.
Ames is a very confused person, right? So like I don't feel like the book should really be taken as endorsing this idea, which I don't think is a very good one. And in particular, it's like one is that like not everybody died. People are around.
Yeah.
Like,
Good point.
um, and so there's a very confusing sense of that. The other thing is that oftentimes it like reflects this kind of like fantasy of like a familial structure that's supposed to fix everything that is actually kind of like mirroring everybody's errors in that book, right? Like Reese thinks if only I can be admitted to like kind of Sex in the City, like kind of normative, I don't know, like normative female heterosexuality,
Mm.
then everything will be right. If only I can be admitted to being a mom, everything will be all right. Now, actually, people who are in those structures are struggling to get out of them. In fact, because what are they struggling with? They wish they were exciting enough that their husband didn't cheat on them with a trans woman, right? That's a subplot. Um, they're wishing that they had some kind of community or kind of countercultural investment. And how does that get expressed? Through their doTERRA essential oils parties and the Wim Hof method, right? Like there's a sense that the people that are in the counterculture are pathetically grasping at what they think as normality, and the people who are normal are pathetically grasping at the counterculture, and they're all chasing their tails. And here's Ames, and what does Ames think that he wants? Well, he thinks that he wants uh, some kind of structure, some kind of continuity, like idea of elders or something like that. And this is all always an anthropological fantasy, right? Like when we say the word elders, right? That this is something where like, well, I know what old people are. Is that what you mean by elders, or do you mean the specific roles of elders in various like indigenous societies that actually had a fixed place for that? Do you mean like enormous, tightly bound, multi-generational families? Well, maybe you like that, but you might actually find that it's harder to be queer in that kind of environment than you think. Like plenty of people actually do have, multi-generational continuity. Some people run away from their multi-generational continuity. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so there's a weirdness there. And like at the same time, we actually do hear about mother-daughter dynamics, and we hear that it's dysfunctional,
Yeah.
right? Like we hear about, Reese's relationship to Talia's relationship to the young twinks or something who are halfway to transitioning, and it's all very confused. So again, like there are all these kind of mirrorings in the book, and basically anything that somebody says, I like, like in a musical, somebody comes out the first time, they sing their "I Wish" song in that book. The beautiful, like the clever thing about that book is that no matter what somebody wishes for in that book, there's somebody else in that book who has it and doesn't want it, and is trying to escape from it. And I think that's really important. So then when I go to the elephant theory, it's
Yeah.
like, well, what does it look like to say, oh, these people, they just don't act right? Why? Because they're a fatherless community. Wow, okay, that sounds like just racism, right? I mean, that's like
Right.
a actually classic line. Like we always say, oh yes, well, those people, they come from broken homes. Those
Mm-hmm.
people, they don't have good families, they don't have fathers, etc. And like we kind of understand that when we say something like that, we're saying something incredibly fucked up. And that in particular, it's not just that it's like kind of offensive because it rhymes with something that mean people say. It's that it's wrong in the sense that like, well, we should actually look a little bit past that. Like, yes, homes are broken, and yes, that hurts, but how did they get broken? Why aren't people able to pick themselves back up? Why aren't they able to put it back together? Why aren't they able to, build a resilient culture that survives that, or adapts to that. And then you start to say like, oh, it starts to look like actually more like, poverty, access to medicine, like a garbage built environment, no access to work, no access to money, everybody in debt, like, your usual kind of like, left wing social concerns, if that's your point of view. I think it's mine. And like when I look at that, it's like, well, what an incredibly weird lack of perspective to be like, wow, the thing that's wrong with trans women is that they don't have like a mama bear picking them up by the scruff. Well, I guess like a mother cat or something would do that. Like they kind of grab you by the scruff
Yeah,
and they pick you up,
I
and
think
it's like
bears might do that
that
too.
that seems kind of off. And it's like a point of view that is actually kind of missing. Like, well, aren't there some other things that might be a little bit difficult to take? Like, what what just to what extent are people, hurting for money? To what extent are people traumatized? To what extent are people, moving on the outs because they are burdened with a deep sense of shame of, about who they are? Like these kinds of things um, are, you know, and
I mean,
like,
it's kind of a holistic issue that way, isn't it? That
mhm.
I mean, a lot of people who don't have this community, this support structure, do struggle uh, financially. I think I know that's like the experience I've had myself coming up as well. I mean, we spent a lot of time in the last 10 minutes talking about Tori's book, but I wanted to bring it back to Darryll. Um, Speaking of what would be, I mean, you said you wanted to avoid the sort of egg theory, but in Daryl's interactions with Uthune, I mean, I guess in some ways he's sort of hoping she'll just tell him the answers to everything he's looking for in that sense.
Well, so there's something I wanted to capture with
Mm-hmm.
that interaction, which is that so we don't actually hear Uthune's voice many times in the book. Like she barely speaks. In general, people who are not Darryll barely speak.
Mm-hmm.
And so we really have like his impressions. He reports on what they say. And with Uthune, he doesn't usually quote her, but he always says, I feel like she's trying to convince me to be trans. Well, what does that mean actually? Right? Because I've had this happen actually, where people will kind of start gender conversations with me, and then they'll think that I'm trying to convince them to be trans because it's like no good deed goes unpunished. Like I thought I was being nice by talking to you about it. Right? You brought it up with me.
Right.
But I think that people in general have a difficulty taking responsibility for their own fascinations and their own desires. And, there are a lot of people who will want to, they'll want to talk about gender when they're drunk, or they'll want to pick you up at the bar, but they won't want to be seen with you in the morning. But that kind of, like he has that, and he doesn't have the most extreme kind of like violent version of that. Like it doesn't turn over into revulsion, but he does have this sense that he can't take responsibility for what's happening in these conversations. And he swings around like a tremendous amount of condescension when he interacts with trans women. But we don't really hear what those trans women have to say. And I somehow wanted to represent that interaction from the outside because like I've experienced that. Like that is something that I've experienced many times where people, you know, they get incredibly weird with me about gender, this and that, and I'm just like, wow, like we could have talked about
I think that I think we've lost Jackie just for a second. I don't know if you can hear me.
whoa,
Oh, I hear you
can
now.
you hear me?
I can hear you now. We can
Oh
see you now. You just
no.
froze out for a second there.
Okay. All
Uh,
right. Yeah, I wonder what
where were
happened.
you when we lost you? Yeah, I guess just pick back up where you were going with talking about Darryll and sort of his projection onto the
Yeah, I
people
mean, I
around him.
just think that basically Darryll is a character who's not able to take responsibility for his own fascinations.
Hmm.
And so there are these currents that sort of whip him around. And he often imagines that other people have great intentions for him, which they may not. They may just be trying to live their lives, or they may think like, oh, cool, like I met this new guy, like he seems like he could be a friend. Maybe he seems like he could be a lover. Maybe he seems like he could be a client. Like there's quite a number of people in Darryll who I think if you read between the lines, they have some amount of sex work involvement. It's explicit with Satori, but how are those trans girls making money? By the way, like, and we don't have to like make extreme assumptions about
Mm-hmm.
that. But I think that there are a lot of people who are meeting Darryll and they're not necessarily knowing like just how unhinged and how lost he actually is, and how actually dangerous he is. Right? That's something that kind of comes through. I mean, Darryll, if you were to take his point of view, really, he might think I didn't do anything the whole book. I didn't do anything. Well, like I kind of fell in love with this guy. Well, yeah, but then I was kind of falling in love with this girl. But I went to the library and I looked up some old newspaper articles. But he doesn't think of himself as really active. Um,
I mean,
Although of
speaking
course he has
speaking again
effects.
to this. Sorry, I keep bringing up the egg thing in the book with Darryll, but before I had come out to myself, I had a lot of similar things where I thought I was, um, to use a horrible 4chan term, like an NPC, a non-player character. I just assumed like it's all right when these things pass me by because I'm not one of the real people around. Darryll to me seems like he's got elements of that, and also elements of sort of a main character syndrome where he simultaneously thinks it's like almost like he knows he's the main character of this book, but at the same time he's completely passive.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like Darryll is somebody who has done something that resembles like he's like a little bit borderline. He gets like a halfway diagnosis of that partway in the book, and I think he's like a person who's reclaimed that in a way.
Mm-hmm.
So he has this very unstable sense of self, and he doesn't expect that to get better. He doesn't think that there's anything wrong with that. He thinks that's the truth, and he's interested in experiences that bring that out as much as possible. So that includes some experiences of shame and rejection and being replaced and being made irrelevant and so on. And it also includes ways that he just gloms onto people and he's like, you are my life, you are my world, and you're the truth. And like, he thinks Bill is Christ and he
Yeah,
thinks Satori is a goddess. And like, but like he's able to form these, kind of like it's similar like to splitting, but he just doesn't have really a negative side of splitting. And so that was important. I mean, and I think that with regards to his Agnes or whatever, I don't
mm-hmm.
like that term, but I'm stuck with it. Um,
It's
I
become an
really
easy
wanted to write
shorthand.
a kind of character that was a little bit dangerous in that sense, where basically he has a lot in common with a lot of people who transition, and he doesn't. And that's a little bit scary because if you admit that there are people, because he could, right? Like if Darryll, if the next chapter of the book was Darryll was like, yeah, honestly, I should start transitioning, we would all be like, yeah, I mean, probably
Yeah,
go for that. Seems like it might work. Um, like, and there are a lot of people who have this relationship to gender where it's like you would be welcome to do whatever you want if you think that it would make you happier, but if you don't think it really works with your life, nobody's pushing you, and maybe you just won't. Now, if but that's like kind of different than the narratives of necessity that attend like most conversations about trans stuff, right? And somehow that when we talk about trans stuff, I think usually like it's not a free conversation, right? Because we have to have a conversation that is going to work for like talking to doctors, talking to psychiatrists, talking to various kind of liberal advocacy orgs,
mm-hmm.
talking to your parents and your lovers and a million people in the world who don't understand. So actually, we have to get our story straight, and we actually have to say something that's kind of simple. And the thing that we have to say, I mean, it's got a lot of pressures on it, right? Like you can say like, well, on the one hand, I want to say I'm very competent. I know what I'm doing. I understand what this is. Let me take charge of this process. On the other hand, we want to say this is desperate. This is tearing me apart. I'll die if I don't do it, right? And it's actually very hard, to have a narrative that simultaneously, and I mean, I'm talking not about a narrative in a book, but like when I'm talking about myself, my own life, somehow I have to communicate these two things that are really at odds. One is this is of deadly importance and it's tearing me apart. Something in my brain is going to kill me if I don't do what I need to do. And on the other hand, I've got to say, by the way, I'm also completely competent and that does not compromise my judgment in any way. Wow,
But
it's
there's this
difficult.
expectation of like rationality that for other things, like no, I think what I was gonna say there, I disagree with myself, so I'm just gonna move on from that.
Well, the expectation it comes from it doesn't come from the philosophical conversation about it. The expectation just comes from the fact that you're sitting across the table from somebody and you've got to negotiate, right?
Yeah.
Like if other people had to negotiate for their gender in a bureaucratic context, then their gender also would be placed under enormous stress. Ours is under enormous stress because we actually have to go and get a new passport and we have to go and get surgery and hormones and get people to call us by different names and different pronouns and walk through the world and get people to stop treating us as freaks and stop trying to like jump into bed with us and then decide the next day that they've got to get rid of us because we make them gay or something. Like there's a million things
Hmm.
that we have to do that are like you know concrete pressures in the world, and that forces us into this explicitness. But so what I just want to say about that is like, because whatever, that's like trans theory, whatever, right? So I wanted to write something that is a little bit at odds with trans theory, right? Because actually in this book, that those pressures are not there. That's part of what I get from being a writer, is that when I'm in a literary context, I can actually put all of that down and I can have characters who, for example, do things like approach transition in a relatively non-urgent light. I can have characters who are like wrong, about their transition. We're like, yeah, I could take it or leave it, or maybe they're like, yeah, maybe I should, but that they shouldn't, like, and you can kind of mess around with it, and you have a kind of freedom um, that I think in the real world we don't, and it will never be a free conversation until we're free people, right? I mean, that's one thing where it's like I don't want to just be like an edgelord or something about this and say that like you know like haha like I'm thumbing my nose at all of those stupid trans activists who like think that they've got to tell a goody two shoes story. No, 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 they're right, they have to tell that story, I have to tell that story, and I do tell that story. But I think that literature is potentially a place where things can get a little bit dicier, and I think that people have trusted me, to go pretty far with that in this book. I hope that they continue to extend their goodwill to my next book. But I mean that's a kind of thing like there's something that's a little bit refreshing, but also a little bit unsettling about reading accounts like that don't seem to defend trans identity in the right way that you would need to if what you were doing was like the discourse. Um,
Well, I found the book quite existentially terrifying in some parts, um, and I think
that's it's working.
so. It's yeah, something I couldn't put my finger on is what you're explaining. I think what makes Darryll such a interesting character from that point of view is his privilege. He has this. Until he realizes he might not, he has this sort of complete financial freedom, and he doesn't have to work. He's sort of in some ways like the anti-dude from The Big Lebowski.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you find that offensive in any way, but I mean the dude
Not at all. I love that
is
movie.
he's very confident and comfortable with himself, but he's the same thing. He doesn't have to work. The backstory there is that didn't make it to the cut is that his dad invented the Rubik's cube. But yeah, I th- I think with Darryll, it's an inheritance, right?
Yeah, he has an inheritance, and I don't specify in the book where it came from, but I'm
But I
actually
mean
happy to accept that it's Rubik's money,
well,
and that
I think
Darryl is
to
like living
myself
on
like,
an inheritance that it's like he gets a trust
hmm.
fund from Mensa or something like that.
But maybe there's also the possibility that though he has this freedom, it comes from a traumatic experience, like losing someone he loved or someone he relied on, and I mean maybe it's a catalyst. I mean there's a lot of questions get asked reading it, and I wasn't quite prepared um, for that going in, but I think I was putting a lot of my own previous prejudices into it as well, and I mean, I like a book that does that to me. That's not a
Well, I really
question.
appreciate
I'm just
that you went in with it.
yeah. I mean,
And I agree that his money underwrites his attitude in a big way. And I think that that was kind of part of what I wanted to do is that, you know, like, you know, following the analysis from before, like if I actually believe that trans people are sort of not free to speak, you know, because our discourse is under these concrete pressures, because it has to do these things, like it has to function bureaucratically, medically, blah, blah, blah. It has to function in the rights discourse. It has to do all this stuff, and so we're less free to speak. So then here's Darryll, and he is free to speak because there are no pressures on his identity. Nobody really makes him show up to anything. It
yeah,
doesn't matter how weird he gets. It starts to look about halfway through the book like this guy is like tripping every day. Could you do that? Could I do that? I don't think so. It looks like I'm tripping because I'm in a Maxfield Parrish painting. I mean, for people who are watching on Twitch, but like, uh, that isn't,
it's not as
you know, like his,
available.
what's that? Yeah,
It's
it's not
not
as
as
available.
available, that option of just tripping every day and dissociating. I mean, I have had parts of my life where I had that, but the consequences were a lot more real than what Darryll faces from his perspective.
Yeah, he gets some consequences, but they're kind of slow burners. You know, he never gets consequences fast enough to really learn from them, but he does incur a few.
Yeah, and I mean it's quite it's almost like a slice of life for Darryll. I'm sure that some of these consequences will come to fruition in another few chapters, but I mean it ends at the right time, and I'm not going to give anything away. I remember I messaged you right away on Twitter after the ending, thanking you for it because I was um hoping for something like that. I'm giving too much away myself, but I just wanted to loop back to um the concept of transliterature. How I even found this book in the beginning is I read Detransition Baby because of all of the buzz about it everywhere, like you were saying, and I had not actually been exposed to too much transliterature. I'm late in life transitioner myself, and it was
I
on
think you're a
good
bit young to be late in life, but yeah.
late in my own life. I guess that's true for every single person who's ever transitioned. It's because it's the latest thing they've done at that time. Um, but I think I found Darryll in some Goodreads lists of transliterature,
Mm.
and I'm glad I
Yeah, those
did.
people have been
And
good to me.
so I think that that's important from that perspective. But what I wanted to ask is, I feel like you know, I have to rephrase this question in my mind because I was gonna say I feel like we're in a transliterature renaissance, but having just admitted that I haven't really previously been exposed to it, will you agree that we are, or am I just discovering it?
Um, I think it's a good situation. There are a surprising number of trans writers getting published right now, and that it feels a little bit new. Like more people are getting books out. Like people are getting books out on big presses, and it's a different kind of book. Like there have been trans books forever, but a lot of them were either like memoir or YA. A lot of them had this very kind of like explainer feel. Like it'd be a story about like, you know, a trans girl in high school, and the ending is that she victoriously gets to have surgery or something like that. Or it would be like a very rich trans person saying like this is the story of my journey, or a very hard up trans person saying this is the story of my journey. But there were like there were a few boxes, and I think that most of what you could find did fit into that. Like I'm trying to like avoid the point of like the kind of excessively periodizing point of view, because there are things like you know, Braz Kavani or um, Jeff Brown or I don't know. I mean, friends of mine are much more kind of like classic translated obsessives, and I think I might go like to somebody like Mira Soleil Ross
Mm-hmm.
and Vivian Namaste, etc. Like these writers who I think of as like more in the '90s. Um, but most of this stuff doesn't make it out onto big presses, I have to admit. And so that is new. Like we're finding audiences in a way that I think we hadn't before. Um, I also think that it's kind of nice that trans literature has a little bit of temporality. So I can write trans literature that in some ways reacts to earlier phases of trans literature or earlier specific books. Um, and we're able to function a little bit as a kind of like a, like a almost like a national literature or something like that. Um, and I'm glad we can do that. So it seems big, and there's all these books coming out, so it's great. I feel kind of bad because I'm not reading a lot of people's books right now, and that's just I've I'm like heavily writing and editing, and I kind of just don't want to let it in. But I'm really looking forward to catching up to it. Like I know, like Jean Thornton has a book coming out, Rika Aoki has a book coming out, Casey Plett has a book coming out all this year, and like when I started, like my idea of trans literature was like these people. Oh, and Imogen's getting all of her stuff reissued.
Mm-hmm.
Tori's reissuing all the novellas, and like I think like actually, I think I can say that she's like also adding some new material there. Like it won't only be the things that you've been able to read before. So when I look at that, I'm like, okay,
This
so
isn't
a
an
lot of the heavy
exclusive, is it?
hitters are really doing their thing right now. Um, and there are a ton of people also who,
Oh, we've got a freeze again.
okay,
You've
did I freeze?
refreshed. You've
Did I freeze?
refreshed. Yeah. You were saying tons
Yeah,
of
I mean,
people who.
I was just about to say that there's a lot of people, like I'm just mentioning the people who really don't need my help to be mentioned because, they whatever, they're all on big presses or whatever. But, you know, um, I feel like you should look at Frog K's stuff, Paris Green, Yuri Rando on Twitter, um, who writes these like really crazy short stories. They kind of feel like a little bit like Kafka or something, and
Mm-hmm.
I think anyway, I mean, maybe they're more like Kleist than Kafka. I don't know, but um, there's a very, very intense voice there. And there's something going on there that I think is very different than and really ahead of a lot of the things that we think of as like trans literature. And this is like, like I'm speaking about like, because this is like the more kind of like experimental lit side of things, like Never, Angela North, like Sea Witch. She has another piece coming out. I don't remember where it's coming out, but I've heard bits of that that's coming along. But I don't know. It's like with this much stuff coming out and this much stuff going on, I suppose we could say that. I wonder what the implications are of calling it a renaissance. I'm always careful about that word because it just sort of has this implication that like we should be reading Plato and kind of I don't know. We should be painting more.
I guess it's
I,
just an
I miss
easy
that
shorthand.
actually. That's
Painting.
something. I don't know how to do it, but I feel like I wish there were more trans painters. Like I know about Kat Graham, um, and but I don't know like who is interested in trans visual form. And I know it's out there, but I see like a lot of photography, um, and this is just my ignorance, but I would love to know like if you look at like I don't know, well, I'm about to go on a rant. I'm not going to do it, but I
I
would
almost
love to
want you
see
to
more
now.
more trans painting. Um,
Well, that kind of leads into you seem to know at least a hell of a lot more trans authors, established and up and coming, than I do. How would you recommend people dip their toes in and start feeling around, because it can be quite opaque, kind of impenetrable. Like I felt like I had to work to find even the books I was coming across, which are somewhat mainstream in the space.
yeah. Um, That's kind of tough. Like this is one of those things where I kind of feel like I'm a little bit irresponsible as a like a trans writer. Like, that I should actually have like a better list ready to hand, or I should be like, this is my profile of everybody's stuff. Um, but I mean, I think that like if you look at like, a person I should have mentioned, like Alex McElroy, um, just wrote The Atmospherians, um, who's been writing like um, a lot more kind of like, broad sympathetic pieces, like people who write like lists. I really haven't written very many lists. I wrote one list of favorite books, and I realize now that like it didn't have any trans stuff on it at all. It was like, yeah, like here's this book by these like, scuba diving artists, and here's this book by this acid chemist, and here's this book about the Harlem Renaissance, and it was just like I didn't I probably had pissed off the editors because like it ran in Peach Mag,
Mm.
and they were like, yeah, like give us a list of your favorite books, and introduce us to your world. And I was like, okay, here's what I'm actually reading. Yeah, you gotta check it out. It's called The Rose of Paracelsus. Crazy, man. Like he was in jail for like 20 years, and he was in prison actually, and he wrote this thing in pencil. It's this amazing book. But anyway, um, what to say? Um, I think that Twitter has been actually pretty helpful for finding people.
Yeah,
Of course, it can be a bit annoying because people love to argue about it, and I think just incredibly obnoxious ways. Like they often argue about trans literature in this way that's sort of like I don't know, like it presumes a little bit more freedom to choose how you write than I think writers actually have, right?
yeah,
Like if it turns out that there's like a better kind of writing to do, then I'm fucked because I'm not going to do it. I'm going to keep doing what I do. And like partly because I wouldn't be able to catch up. Like if it turns out that everybody needs to be writing experimental literature, then I'd just be like, okay, well, sucks for me, but because this is the kind of book that I think I know how to write, and I've written another book that's kind of at least formally not very different, although it's different. Um,
I'd say at least the
but
subject matter is quite experimental. I've never read a book
yeah,
about a cock before Darryll. I mean, not explicitly. I mean, I know the word cuckold comes from Shakespeare, but
yeah. I mean Ulysses, maybe I don't know,
maybe.
um, yes, yes, yes.
But yeah, you've
Um,
hinted at this other book that you may release. Um, so we've got about 5 minutes left. I just wanted to ask what's on the horizon. What can we expect to come out of the Jackie Ess press?
well, I'm not trying to do it on my own press, so I think
No.
I've got to be kind of careful about what I'm gonna do with it. It's at this stage right now where I'm like starting to think about sending it out. I put Darryll out with Flash Press, and that has been such a great experience that I think that like very, very likely that I will try to see if I can do it with them. But for a couple of reasons, I'm gonna hold back on committing to anything right now. Um, I've been doing that. I also have been trying to pitch a TV show, which we'll see if that goes. We'll see if I'm actually capable of writing for television. Also, like I just said that I can only write one way, but I'm trying to write another way at the same time, and we'll see if that works. But the next book, right now the working title of the manuscript is Fruit, and it uh, follows a slightly younger crowd, a young guy named Adam, who possibly is going to become Moonbeam, the character in Darrow a few years later. Um,
Okay.
but I'm going to leave that a little bit loose, and it kind of follows him through the Bay Area, um, through the perfume industry, among other places. Um, and yeah, I don't think I want to like really do the plot or pitch it, but partly just because I'm like so sunk in it, like I could just tell you about like this is the chapter that I'm editing right now, and that kind of would not really convey what it is.
I mean, personally, I'd love to hear it, but yeah, I'm sure you don't want to be spilling that out to the world. And we've only got a couple of minutes left, but I'm going to be keeping my ear to the ground for that one to come out. Where can people follow you online and see what you're up to?
Yeah, you can follow me at Jackie underscore S, ESS. Like it's just first name, last name, because that's, probably it's in the event description of some kind. But on Twitter. Um, I have an Instagram, Trip to Taller Windows, but like don't use it. I mean, you can follow it, whatever, but like my phone broke like 5 months ago and I haven't gotten a new one, so I'm probably never going to use Instagram again. And although I read it, because I just like want to read meme pages on there. Fucking great. And whatever. What else? Like I've never even seen SpongeBob, but I'm like now I have like really like it's burned in.
Yeah.
What else? Oh, something that I forgot to mention actually is that I think that one of the most kind of like sympathetic and responsible chroniclers of trans literature right now is Mackenzie Wark, and
Mackenzie
you should
Ward, did you
really
say?
Mackenzie Wark, who's also Australian, for what it's worth,
Okay.
um, but
I won't hold it against her.
from the other side,
Yeah.
yeah, um, but she is one of the people. It's like, I think it's one of these things where it's like it's very hard to actually maintain your enthusiasm for like just trying to put all the girls on, and she really does that more than like anybody that I know. And so I would say that like people who are looking for trans literature, just like in general, they should try to look into Mackenzie's stuff. I mean, Mackenzie has a book, autofiction kind of thing called Reverse Cowgirl, but mostly I think like um, it's the occasional writing that Mackenzie has done during the transition, whether it was about raves, whether it was about trans writing, and trans art in general, trans film, all this stuff. Like I feel like actually Mackenzie is often my source for like what is going on in trans world. And I mean we help each other. I mean I think that there are things that I was able to show her as well, but I definitely wanted to point to that because I think that like I'm a really bad hub for this kind of stuff. Because like ultimately artists are too selfish. I mean, we are, and
You've
because we
mentioned
have
so
to
many
be
more
in the
names
project.
than I think you have. I mean, I put the pressure on you. I've said you're the gatekeeper to the world of trans literature for our listeners, and that's just not true. And you still managed to mention more names than I could think of by far.
Yeah, well, I'm gonna be absolutely kicking myself after this because I'm just gonna realize that like I didn't mention somebody who's like totally obviously I would have mentioned them. So hello if you're out there. I didn't mean to leave you out.
And thanks for
But
listening as well.
yes, well, also that, yeah, also that. But yeah, like next I'm gonna bring more breadcrumbs next time. That seems important. Um, but I don't know, like it's actually it's a very rich field right now. So I think in a way, like one of the ways that you can find out what's going on is that you can pick up any translit book and look at the acknowledgments, and you'll see all these names, and you'll be like, who is that? And then you'll be like, oh wait, I know that person.
Oh, I'm gonna be
And
doing that for sure. I'm gonna ask you for some
yeah,
spelling after this probably because I'm gonna want to do some further reading myself. I'd really love to talk to you for another 2 hours about all of this because I got through about two or three of my 12
well, I'm happy
questions.
to go over. I mean, it's no big deal for me, but if you cap it an hour, you cap it an hour.
Yeah, I do have to go myself. But I mean, I'd love to have you back on sometime if you'd be interested.
Always up for it. Yeah, I'll
Totally.
find a different painting. We'll do this thing.
I'm sure there's
This has
another
been just
painting.
super fun.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming tonight. And breaking the ice on our triumphant return. And thank you for
Yeah.
Darryll. Actually, yeah. Where is the best place for people to purchase Darryll or consume it?
Um, it's not a big deal to me. You can buy it directly from the publisher. We love that. You can buy it from Bookshop. We love that. Um, you can buy it from Amazon if you want. I mean, it's there if you like Amazon. There is a Kindle edition. I have a non-Kindle ebook of it, which I've realized recently that people have no way to buy. And so I want to fix that. Like, I think that we should make it available like in a Kobo store or something like that. Because I worry that sometimes that people who want to read it as an ebook, but don't like Amazon, have had trouble accessing it. And oftentimes those people email me and I'm just like, whatever, I'll just give you the file. Um, and, uh, but but stay tuned for that. There will be a better story about that, like non-Amazon ebook thing. But I think that for now, if you want a physical book, and let me say another really good way of getting it is to get it from bookstores, and they exist, and many of them are open now. People have vaccines, etc., and people do outdoor pickup and delivery and million different ways that bookstores are staying in business. So you can absolutely get Darryll from your bookstore. You just tell them to carry it. Like, say, I want to buy this. Do you have Darryll? If you call them and ask them that, they will probably get it for you. They will probably say, no, we don't have it, but we'll get it for you if you want to come in a week, and it'll be there. And that's actually one of the wonderful things for me because it means that, like, because anyway, my press is very competent. They're Clash Books, and they do booksellers, they're the system that they have. They have a return system. So booksellers are able to buy books from publishers and distributors, and then if the books don't sell, they can get refunds on them. And that's how bookstores are able to like have a storefront that is full of books, knowing that of course they don't all sell. Right? And so we have that set up. And so I think we're set up so that like at least in the U.S., pretty much any bookstore should be able to get it. Outside of the U.S., I think there have been issues. I know that there are bookstores in the UK that carry it,
Right.
but I think that I've sent files to people internationally more often. I'm very interested in doing international releases, translations, maybe, I don't know. But all that is remains to be figured out. People should also hit me up. Like I said, my Instagram is Trip to Taller Windows, and I don't use it, but I have DMs, and I also have an email address, triptotollerwindows@protonmail.com. So, whatever. Find me.
Great. Well, yep, read Darryll, follow Jackie, and follow me as well. You can find all my links at xanthea.ca. That's xanthea.ca. Thanks everybody for watching or listening, depending on which you are. And we'll see you in 2 weeks at 7:30 p.m. right here on twitch.tv/cavegoblins. Goodbye.